start the recording.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for jumping in during the lunch hour for this quick briefing. My name is Lisa Buehler. I'm going to be your moderator today, and we're doing a briefing on the early release drafts of the Delta Mendota Subbasin for the single groundwater sustainability plan. Our two main speakers today are going to be John Brody. He is the plan manager, and Anona Dutton. She is the technical consultant that's working on this from EKI. During this session, we have left open the chat. We're going to hold all of the questions until the end of the session. And with that, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will go back to the chat and use that for the queue. You'll also have an opportunity to be able to ask the questions verbally. We're happy to open your mic to do that. We will use regular ground rules, rules of protocol. We don't normally find that to be a concern. So just so you're aware of it, though, we will do that. We are also recording today. So John, are you able to see the poll? In the
yeah, I do. Let me see.
And we have one question for the group.
So I will go ahead and launch.
Perfect. Thank you. So we'd like to find out a little bit more about you. Many of us know one another, but we don't know everybody. So this is the question: how much do you know about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Groundwater Sustainability Agencies? And this is important for us. If there's folks who don't know a lot, I will spend a little bit more time when we introduce terms to explain them. And if something is not clear to you, please, please, please just put it in the chat. So I'm going to look. I've got 21 of 32 of you. Just give me a few more. I see. I love the first answer more than I want. But it looks like almost everybody here has got some basic understanding. And once again, if something's not clear to you, if you're in the not much group, just put it in the poll or in the chat, excuse me, and we will be sure to help you get some more information to you to help you with that. So let's see here. We're pretty close to folks. How about two more of you answer, and then we'll go ahead and end the poll. You're getting there. One more. Oh, they're being stubborn, John. One more. Okay. Here we go. So here's the answers. And these are more than I want was 22%. 44% of you said you have a pretty good handle on it. 22% said you know the basics, and the last group of you said there's a few of you, not much. Once again, please use that chat. Okay, so I think we're ready to move on. So why don't I turn this over then to John to make a couple of comments. And John, why are we here? And once again, this is John Brody.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the 23 Groundwater Sustainability Agencies here in the subbasin, the Delta Mendota Subbasin, I want to welcome you to this webinar. In this briefing, we'll be providing you some information on these sections of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan that have been released for your early review. We hope you will use the opportunity to begin your review of the document now. That way, when the rest of the chapters are released, you won't feel so overwhelmed at the volume of information to be reviewed. So we welcome your comments and suggestions on the draft document, these draft chapters. We'll answer any questions that we can to make your review and comments meaningful to the process. And again, please hold those questions to the end of this webinar. As the process stands right now, the adequacy of this single GSP will be determined by the State Water Resources Control Board. So we've been working with Water Board staff as we amend and compile this GSP. So Lisa, if you could go to that next slide. There we go. So you see where we are in the process. As of right now, we would like your input and comments on this draft so we can incorporate them into the document we intend to submit to the State Water Resources Control Board this summer. It's our intention to have State Water Board staff review this new and improved document rather than the 6 existing GSPs that were determined inadequate by DWR. So when making a recommendation to the board on whether this subbasin should be approved to implement this GSP or be placed on probation. So we would rather have this new and improved document reviewed by board staff rather than the other ones. So Lisa, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. So these are the things we're going to be covering today. We had a chance for a little bit of welcome and greetings and learned a teeny bit about you when we did the poll. And John's just covered the session purpose and timeline. Now I'm going through the agenda. The first part of what we're going to talk about is what the GSP is supposed to do and the public review process. So the actual GSP will jump into this, but it has a job. Then we're going to have a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today and what the chapters are that we're covering. These were the early release chapters and how to review the plan and ways to get back. And at the end, John will kind of talk a little bit about what the next steps are. So once again, this is a working document. It has a specific job, so it's been structured in a way to accomplish the job. It has to meet the requirements of SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And this is very specific. It has some certain outcomes around sustainability. All that is actually in the law. The law was expanded through a regulatory process so the Department of Water Resources issued a set of guidelines, and they laid out all the things that had to be in this plan. So this GSP has to fulfill that. Interestingly enough, some of them didn't do that, and that's partly why they were sent back to the GSAs to redo them. One of the things that this plan is also going to do, and you had a chance to hear from John about this, it's going to address the deficiencies identified in the previous subbasin GSP submissions. And then it should also inform tribes, local jurisdictions, the beneficial uses and users of the groundwater, and the public about what's actually in the plan and the contents so that they have an opportunity to be properly engaged and provide input. So in terms of the regulatory processes, there's the statute set out the legislation package. So it described what the sustainable groundwater management is and what the GSAs have to do. It also set forward a timeline in which they had to act. So this was a 20-year time frame. So as I think as you read this, will be interesting to you as you look at what the GSP is proposing. It's proposed that these things will be completed. All of us who work in water know it takes a long time for things to be done. So as things are being written, it's like at the end of, in 2040, this subbasin is sustainable. It also has to make sure there are not any undesirable results caused by the groundwater conditions that are occurring. This is the definition that's used in SGMA. We're talking about the supply, groundwater storage, seawater intrusion, water quality, and land subsidence. So you have to make sure you're not having a depletion of your supply, all of your storage is in good shape, and so on and so forth. I won't read the slide to you. We also, and this is something that's still being worked on. I think a lot of the GSAs are looking for guidance, but it's really important to take a look at the depletions of interconnected surface water and making sure that there aren't any unreasonable or adverse impacts on that. Under the Water Code section, this is the Department of Water Resources regulations. They also list a number of things. One of the things I really appreciate about this particular plan, I work in about 24 subbasins. I'm here as a neutral third party to help the basin think about their plan. One of the nice things that your team has done for you is they've actually pulled out each section of the regulations and they've tied them directly back to the plan chapters. So as you read the plan, you'll be able to see this is what the regulations say. And when you're looking at how that plan is written and the way it's working, you want to make sure that you're in fact doing the thing that the regulations said. And within that, also in the guidance, it says these are the required sections. These are the things that actually must be in the plan and must be addressed. So John, I'll have you talk a little bit about the deficiencies.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself.
That's the hazards of Zoom, isn't it?
Yes, the subbasin specifically is addressing these 4 deficiencies identified by the California Department of Water Resources when it determined the GSPs to be inadequate. One way the GSAs are solving those first 2 deficiencies is by condensing the original 6 groundwater sustainability plans into one. So we have one plan. Everyone will have the same definitions for undesirable results. We'll also have the same data and methodologies. So some of the more specific ways that we're addressing these deficiencies is detailed in chapters that haven't quite been released yet. But from these chapters that are released and are now there on the website for you to view, you can tell that we are using the same data and methodologies. As we've met with State Water Board staff, they've identified, if we can move on to the next slide. So State Water Board staff has identified additional water quality constituents of concern for this subbasin above what was included in our original groundwater sustainability plans. Those constituents of concern shown on the screen for you there. And as you will see in chapters that are yet to be released, we have a monitoring plan in place that includes all of these constituents as identified by the state board.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today are the early release chapters. So the first one is going to be about the purpose, sustainability goal, and you can kind of see from the list here. I've also put on the slide in a little bit lighter text the sections that will be released a little bit later, and John will talk about that at the end, kind of, you know, the rollout period for each of these. They're all very substantive, and there's still discussion going on to help put all these pieces together. So this is what we're talking about today, and there are these future things that we'll be talking about in a future briefing. So I think John and I both can talk about this, but the tips for as people are reading it, what kinds of things do you want them to be thinking about, or what would be most helpful to you, John, as the plan manager, when people are reading the GSP and you're trying to get feedback?
Well, you know, we certainly welcome comments on any aspect of, you know, of the draft that we've released. But in particular, we'd really like to hear thoughts from folks on the accuracy of the information that presented. If they have, you know, any concerns about that, do they have any issues or trouble understanding the information and the concepts being presented? We want to make sure we hear about that, because we want to make sure that this document is clean and understandable. So your comments welcome at the email address that is provided on the screen, and that email is also available through the deltamendota.org website. And go through, you know, either go directly through the email, go through the website. And the website is where you can download the chapters and take a look at them.
Great, thank you. So, and I'm just going to jump into this, but this is kind of how it's laid out. We'll go over what the sections are, and this is also in the document. So when you look at it, it'll lay out, here are all the things that are in this section, and this is, they're calling this the introduction. And you'll be able to kind of see what that layout is and what the page number, you can go straight to it to look at it. And I'll go ahead and let you take over then about the background.
Great. So thank you everyone for your time. And as John said, we really do appreciate the feedback that we'll get from you in the document. We have spent a tremendous amount of time over the last year working with the GSAs to bring all this information into a single cohesive document and also bring it up to date through the end of water year 2023. So what you will see represented throughout the Groundwater Sustainability Plan is the most, comprehensive summary that, we could do, relying on the best available information and science up to the current state of the basin. So, by way of background, this basin has been moving through the SGMA requirements and compliance structure, throughout. 23 Groundwater Sustainability Agencies, or GSAs, were formed in 2017. Originally, there were 6 GSPs that were submitted with a coordination agreement with a common chapter in January of 2020, consistent with the timeline laid out in the statute. DWR did find that initial submission of GSPs to be incomplete, as articulated in a letter in January of 2022. The GSAs at that point had 6 months or 180 days to revise their plan to address the issues identified by DWR. Work effort was done. Those GSPs were submitted in July of 2022. And then, what John alluded to were the sort of final findings from DWR in terms of the in its inadequate determination for this basin. And so since that was released in March of last year, we have been working closely. The GSAs have been meeting extremely frequently with all their technical consultants to coalesce around a updated and refined vision of sustainability for the basin and a clear pathway for how to get there. As part of this, we have been meeting on a near monthly basis with the state board, presenting the data that we are compiling and the approaches we are recommending for sustainability, and incorporating the feedback we have been getting from those very productive conversations into the draft plan that you are, going to be able to see, parts of now, and then the full document next month. So as Lisa alluded to earlier, one of the things we've done to really try to support readability and demonstration of compliance with the regulations is in each and every section, the top part of it includes the exact language extracted from the GSP regulations that were developed by DWR. And then beneath those will be specific sections or subsections that directly map to the regulatory requirements. So, we really have tried to lay out exactly why we're doing what we're doing and how what we're doing complies with the regulations. For example, section 2 of the document that you will see lays out the sustainability goal, which is really the vision for what sustainability looks like in this basin and supports the GSA's pathway to achieve that by 2040. And the goal itself is laid out here. It has actually been a consistent goal of the basin throughout, so we did not revise it as part of this update because the GSAs remain committed to this vision of sustainability. So the next section details the agency information. So this is where you can go through an information for each of the 23 GSAs, and the plan manager can be found. So depending on where you are physically located in the basin, you will be in a different GSA than maybe someone else, in a different part of the basin. And so information is provided in this chapter that is specific to your GSA, to their governing structure, to their, water resources, their management, long-term of, the resources in the basin, where they meet, when they meet. So everything that you need to know so that you can directly be in communication with your GSA can be found, in here, as well as information about the collective management of the basin. and how the basin is collectively coordinating through the management and compliance with SGMA going forward. So, chapter 5 sort of dives into more of that information in terms of, again, kind of details on, this is a very large, complex basin. It's 750,000 acres from a management and jurisdictional standpoint. It's been kind of subdivided into 7 GSA groups, each of which has a representative on the coordination committee, that is the collective decision-making body for the basin and represents the interests of the GSAs therein. There's a wide number of, water resources and management programs that have long been active in this basin in terms of really active conjunctive use operations. There's a tremendous amount of surface water supplied to this basin that supports the wide variety of land uses, agricultural and urban throughout. There's a number of, water districts and other water suppliers. There's a number of cities. There's a number of disadvantaged communities. And this is all described here in some detail, including sort of other management plans that are active in the basin and govern, different land use and other, elements within the basin. So this is really a pretty comprehensive kind of lay of the land, structure, and helps you understand just the size and complexity and all the various sort of planning and jurisdictional, overlays that, SGMA integrates with.
One of the things in this chapter to really you did document the stakeholder engagement, and this is something that it's very important to the basin, but it's also important to the regulators to know that that the GSAs are reaching out, they are wanting to talk to people, and this is not something that was just done in a black box.
Absolutely. Yes, and that's all documented there, including, efforts like today to really, bring the latest and greatest information to the basin stakeholders. So after that kind of, really introduction to the basin from a, jurisdictional kind of viewpoint in many ways and governance, we move into sort of the technical meat and potatoes of the document. And what's really important when you're thinking about planning for a sustainable basin in the future is to really understand the historical and current conditions of that basin. And so that is what the basin setting chapters include. And there are 3 parts to the basin setting. The first is the hydrogeologic conceptual model, which speaks to the geology and the principal aquifers and, those things of the basin. The second part relates to current and historical groundwater conditions across a variety of parameters, including water levels, water quality, and so forth. And the third is a water budget, and that will be something that we'll do a presentation on at a later date. So I'll walk you through here some of the high level summary of what is in these fairly technical chapters, but they are what is the foundation then of how we go about defining sustainability and looking at ways that we can manage the basin towards those objectives. So the first part is in chapter 7 around the hydrogeologic conceptual model. So if we flip back a little bit. So what we've done in this model is we've aggregated all the available geologic data for this basin, whether it's boreholes, whether it's information that DWR, when it did its surveys of the entire Central Valley, it ran transects of geophysics through this basin, information that the local GSAs had been collecting over time. And we put this all into a 3-dimensional model where we can really visualize the basin from all varieties of angles with all the most comprehensive kind of database of that geologic structure of the basin. And in this basin we have 2 principal aquifers. We have an upper aquifer system that extends roughly to about 350 feet below ground surface. Then we have a thick band of what's called the Corcoran clay which really provides a separation between the upper aquifer, and then what's down below is the lower aquifer. And each of these aquifers has different sources of inflows and outflows. They have different aquifer properties, different water quality, and so forth. And so it's important to distinguish between the two of them when we're thinking about adequate monitoring, when we think about how we set sustainability criteria, and when we think about how we manage these aquifer systems. And so we really, spend a lot of time delineating those, and there are varieties throughout the entirety of the basin. And so all those sort of local, things are taken into account. So we have this sort of basin-wide model. We've represented it in, this leapfrog representation. We've also done a number of cross sections or slices through the basin. And an example is shown here, where, we have a long slice through the basin, and you can see there the different mapping of the aquifer units, the clays, the more permeable sands and gravels that are, where the water is mostly moving through the basin, so on and so forth. And this really helps us, again, understand the system and how we're gonna, model it and, manage it going forward. Then, the next section, section 8, again, really looks at historical and current conditions in the basin. And again, we brought this data up to water year 2023. So it's very current information. And we looked at a number of things. And we'll start with, groundwater levels and direction. So, what we did here is we looked at, groundwater levels and how water is moving through the basin. How water levels are changing over time as a result of hydrology and various management actions. We looked at land subsidence conditions throughout the basin. We looked at the presence of interconnected surface waters and groundwater dependent ecosystems. And what you will find in this chapter are a lot of maps, and this really helps tell the story of the basin. And I encourage you, when you're looking through, the words are one thing, but when you start to look at the graphics that are included, you could really see, the story of the basin, if you will. So big picture, what are we seeing in the data? Generally, what's very unique about this basin is that it is, it's long and skinny. It's at the western edge of the Central Valley, and it is surrounded by 9 other groundwater basins. So there's a very dynamic interaction between this basin and adjacent basins. And so when we think about, the definition of sustainability in this basin, we are highly dependent on the sustainability of our neighboring basins. And so it really is a real point of, interest is that cross-basin coordination. So not only are we coordinating within our basin to achieve sustainability, but for us all to achieve success, we have to be in that same level of coordination with our neighboring subbasins, so with that we're all subject to sigma, and we all got to cross this threshold around the 2040 timeframe. So in our basin, because of where we are, water is generally leaving our basin and flowing to our neighbors. And the lower that groundwater elevations are in our neighboring subbasins, the more water leaves our basin and heads towards them. So we really, 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 the stability of our neighboring basin water levels is really, really important to us and our ability to stabilize water level conditions in our basin. What we generally see in the history of this basin, and water levels obviously have their interannual fluctuations, hydrology and, dependent and so forth. We do see the influence of the recent very severe droughts we've had over the last decade. We've had, a sizable number of very, very dry years, and that is reflected in the water level conditions in our basin as it has around the state. We've seen a lot of recovery in those wet years, and we see the impact of the conjunctive use operations in the relative stability in our water levels, but it is something that we are watching very closely. Next slide. The other kind of really important issue to be aware of in the basin is, again, because of our location, which is, adjacent to the coastal ranges, which are marine depositional environment. There are inherent water quality challenges in this basin because of the local geology. And so because of, just the types of materials that constitute our aquifers, we have very elevated levels, for example, of salt in our water. And those of you that extract groundwater from the basin understand, some of the challenges that we face, as well as with some of the other constituents of concern, where numerous studies dating back to the early 1900s have consistently documented the presence of these constituents at elevated concentrations due to naturally occurring conditions in the basin. So we've gone to a lot of effort to try to document these conditions on our basin, so we understand, what in a sense we're dealing with. Because what SGMA requires is that as GSAs, you manage conditions that are caused by your management actions. And those are defined as groundwater extraction or recharge. So as GSAs, you're not responsible for addressing conditions that existed before 2015 or conditions that are not caused by your management. And so what's really important is to sort of baseline what are the existing conditions in the basin that existed pre-SGMA and exist sort of irrespective of management. And so that's what you'll see in this is the effort that's been done to compile all the available data over the historical record to understand what is the key driver? Is it the geology? Is it groundwater management? What are the things that are driving the conditions that we're seeing? And then focus on what we can manage as part of our work towards sustainability. Subsidence is a great example of that. So what's shown here is a map of the cumulative subsidence that's been mapped in the basin between the advent of SGMA, so 2015, and through current essentially, or when we did this work, through 2023. And what you can see is that, here's our basin with the black outline, and we see outside of our basin, we see some really bright colors, the reds and the yellows, right? We see this big sort of bullseye. So what happens is that there's a lot of subsidence happening outside of our basin due to conditions in those subbasins, which are radiating out from that bullseye into our basin. So we are actually seeing measurable subsidence in our basin and parts of our basin where we have no lower aquifer pumping. So generally what is causing subsidence is pumping from the deeper aquifers, across the broader, Central Valley. That's a lot, that is creating compression of the Corcoran clay. So those fine grained materials, and that's creating subsidence. So, while we do have pumping in the lower aquifer of our subbasin, we are also, I think is quite evident from this figure. This is an area where we're really seeking to coordinate with our adjacent subbasins to make sure that, that we can address what we can do in our basin in terms of managing our lower aquifer pumping within the sustainable yield and so on and so forth. But making sure our adjacent subbasins are doing a similar thing so that collectively we can achieve sustainability around important criteria like subsidence. So another important sustainability indicator is around the depletion of interconnected surface waters. And again, SGMA is very specific in terms of what you are required to do, which is to avoid significant and reasonable depletion of interconnected surface waters due to groundwater pumping. And this is an important clarification and distinction, because as you can imagine, there are a lot of things that can affect the depletion of interconnected surface water. So SGMA is very explicit about there has to be that nexus to groundwater pumping. But first and foremost, you have to identify what are interconnected surface water bodies within a basin. And we benefited from the fact that DWR recently has released the first of its 3-part guidance in terms of how to go about doing that. So we have followed, there have been prior, guidance published by the Nature Conservancy and others that we have relied upon, and we're able, because of the timing of this, also to be able to rely on the recent publication by DWR to help us go through and systematically identify those surface water features within the basin that at least at some point during a year have the potential to be interconnected. And those are identified here based on the best available data. So obviously, the San Joaquin River is essentially the basin boundary for us on the eastern side. And that's largely known to be interconnected along, the most of the reach through the basin. Then we have a few kind of more major streams that flow from, west to east across the basin that at this point we are considered likely because they're largely ephemeral streams. They're, sometimes if water's in them, it's actually due to managed operations and releases by the GSAs. And so this is something that additional data is going to be collected to, confirm whether they are or not. But through this identification, it sets us up then to develop sustainable management criteria for them, and also kind of really carefully look at what that nexus is related to groundwater pumping. So the last chapter that's out for public review is about the representative monitoring network. And what that lays out is all of the new and improved monitoring networks for all these sustainability indicators. So, we have 110 wells that are being used to monitor water level conditions across the basin now. And that monitoring frequency is being increased as part of the recommendation of this GSP. We've added many wells, and we now have 91 water quality representative monitoring wells. We have 35 land subsidence monitoring points that are in addition. We're looking at the benchmark data that DWR and the Bureau collect on some of the major infrastructures through the basin, as well as the benchmarks that are used by the San Joaquin River Restoration Program. And then broadly, the INSAR data that DWR publishes on a quarterly basis to look at subsidence across the entirety of the basin. So it's a very robust network. And then we have 25 interconnected surface water monitoring sites, which is a combination of very, very shallow wells and stream gauges along those, identified likely interconnected surface water bodies. So these data and the frequency and the monitoring protocols are all laid out there for your review. And these data are, collected on their, schedules. And then those data are compiled and reported each year in an annual report that's published by the GSAs and submitted to DWR. And you're welcome as a companion review effort is to look at the annual reports that the GSAs have been publishing since 2020. Those are all on the DWR website and really kind of bring you up to date with the state of the basin, both in terms of these sustainability indicators, but also the projects and management actions and other efforts that the GSAs have been making to date on their, march towards sustainability.
Anona, thank you so much. You had to cover quite a bit of ground there, but it was a great overview. So, John, I know you want to keep hearing from people. Do you want to talk a little bit about how they can stay engaged?
Yes, and we really do hope that you will want to stay engaged in this process. The deltamendota.org website is really kind of the hub for you to stay engaged. In addition to finding the draft documents there, both these and the ones that are forthcoming. We have agendas and all the information on upcoming meetings for the various committees that comprise the subbasin. There's a Northern Management Committee, a Central Management Committee, and also the Coordination Committee, All their meetings are open to the public, and the information and agendas for those meetings are posted there at deltamendota.org. We do anticipate that there will be some future webinars and public meetings on this draft single GSP once the full draft document is ready for review and comment. As you know, we mentioned at the outset, this webinar is being recorded. It will be linked on the website, and again, you may submit written comments on this and future drafts through the website or at the email address that you see on the slide there on the screen. And when you do submit your comments, please be as specific as you can.
Great, thank you so much. So we've left a little bit of time at the end. Thank you everyone for participating on chat. I've really appreciated some of the great questions that are coming in. I think people are very interested, John, in learning a little bit more about some of the things that are coming out in future chapters. So for example, someone has asked about, is the GSA preparing terms of the groundwater allocation framework? Is there going to be limitations, restrictions, and so on? When will all of that information be available to people?
Well, we're in the process of, you know, as you can imagine, this is a dynamic and evolving process. We released these early chapters now because they're ready and available for public review, but you know, some of these more complicated issues, you know, like a pumping reduction framework, our sustainable management criteria, you know, some of these things are still being discussed, and the parameters are still being set by the GSA. So we know that we are moving close to the end of this process. So we certainly, you know, hope to have those posted and ready for people to look at by early June.
Okay. Okay. So for the person that asked the question, then it's probably about 2 weeks, they'll be able to give you something more definitive for that. And then I think hopefully we were talking about possibly doing another briefing like this one to continue that. I'm happy to open the microphones. If anyone would like to talk, you can just raise your hand. We've got about, looks like a minute or two left. We also would appreciate your feedback about this briefing, if the briefing was helpful to you. And that's wonderful for us. And also, if you have any other questions that you want to put in the chat, I'm happy to read them for you. So if there's anything else, and I'm not seeing anything so far, we are not inclined to keep people in meetings longer than they need to be. So with that, let me just check in with Anona. Anything else that you want to put in the mix?
Not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. And John, anything that you'd like to offer to the group on the way out the door?
Just please do stay engaged, and please use that DM Sigma at slugma.org. I will be checking that site, you know, especially early on, probably a couple times a day.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody that are once again putting comments in the chat. They're very helpful to us because we want these to be useful to you. So with that, I would say that we can probably go ahead and wrap up and once again, thank everybody for being here. So have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to meeting with you again at the next briefing.